The dust hadn't settled from the transport helicopter when Sarah Chen stepped onto the tarmac of forward operating base Salerno. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly as she shouldered her single duffel bag, her movements economical and precise. Around her, the controlled chaos of a military medical facility hummed with purpose. Medics rushing between buildings, the distant thrum of generators, the sharp smell of disinfectant cutting through the desert air. She made her way to the main hospital building, a prefabricated structure that looked like every other forward surgical hospital she'd seen. The difference was in the details, scuff marks on the floors that spoke of hurried movements, the slight disorganization of supply carts, the way staff moved with just a fraction less precision than she was accustomed to. "You must be the relief nurse." Dr. Martinez didn't look up from his clipboard as Sarah approached the nurse's station. He was a tall man in his 40s, with the kind of confidence that came from being the senior surgeon in a place where his word was law. "Chen, right?" "Yes, sir." Reporting for duty. Martinez finally glanced up, his eyes taking in her crisp scrubs and regulation appearance with barely concealed dismissal. "Well, you're here for 6 weeks. Try to keep up and stay out of the way. This isn't some stateside hospital where you can take your time with everything." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. "Understood. Rodriguez will show you around." Martinez gestured to a harried-looking nurse who was restocking a crash cart. "Maria, take our new relief nurse through the basics. And make sure she understands how we do things here." Maria Rodriguez looked up with tired eyes, offering Sarah a sympathetic smile. "Come on, I'll give you the tour." Fair warning, it's been a rough week. As they walked through the facility, Sarah absorbed every detail. The surgical suites were adequate, but showed signs of corner cutting. Instruments that should have been replaced, sterilization protocols that were rushed, supply management that bordered on chaotic. She said nothing, filing each observation away. "Don't mind Dr. Martinez," Maria said quietly as they passed the break room. "He's actually a good surgeon, just stressed. We all are. This place runs on caffeine and stubbornness." Through the window, Sarah could see the helicopter landing pad where casualties arrived daily. She'd read the reports, knew the statistics, understood the pressure these people worked under. But she also knew that pressure was no excuse for the shortcuts she was already observing. "The other surgeons are Dr. Kim and Dr. Patterson," Maria continued. "They're good people, but they've been here 8 months. Everyone's a little on edge." They entered the main surgical bay, where Dr. Kim was reviewing patient charts. He was younger than Martinez, maybe early 30s, with the intense focus of someone who'd seen too much too young. "This is Sarah Chen, our relief nurse," Maria announced. Dr. Kim looked up briefly, nodded, then returned to his charts. "Hope you're ready to work. We don't have time for hand-holding." Sarah felt the familiar weight of being measured and found wanting before she'd even begun. It was a sensation she'd grown accustomed to over the years, the assumption that quiet competence meant incompetence, that her reserved demeanor indicated weakness rather than discipline. "I'm ready," she said simply to Dr. Patterson emerged from a supply closet, his arms full of surgical packs. He was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in field hospitals. "Another relief nurse? What happened to the last one?" "Couldn't handle the pace," Martinez called from across the room. "Requested transfer after 2 weeks. Let's see if this one lasts longer." Sarah absorbed the comment without reaction, though she noted the way the permanent staff exchanged glances. There was a story there, one that spoke to the culture of this place. She'd encountered it before, medical units that had closed ranks, that viewed outsiders with suspicion and treated temporary assignments as disruptions rather than assistance. "Your shift starts at 0600, Martinez said, finally approaching her directly. "We're on a tight ship here, Nurse Chen. Follow protocols, don't question procedures, and remember that in a combat zone, the doctors make the decisions." "Clear. Crystal clear, sir." As the day's shift ended and Sarah settled into her temporary quarters, she reflected on her first impressions. The medical staff was competent but insular, protective of their methods, even when those methods were questionable. They'd already decided she was temporary, expendable, not worth their full respect or attention. It was exactly the kind of environment where problems festered unchecked, where egos overrode safety, where the very people meant to save lives might be putting them at risk through arrogance and complacency. Sarah unpacked her few belongings, her movements methodical and unhurried. Tomorrow she would begin her real work, and these people would continue to underestimate her. For now, that was exactly what she needed. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 0545. Sarah was already awake, had been for 20 minutes, lying still in her narrow bunk and listening to the sounds of the base coming to life. She dressed quickly in fresh scrubs, her movements automatic and efficient. The surgical bay was already bustling when she arrived. Dr. Martinez was reviewing the night's casualties with Dr. Kim, their voices low but urgent. 3 soldiers had come in during the early morning hours, 2 with shrapnel wounds, 1 with a traumatic brain injury from an IED blast. Chen. Martinez barely glanced at her. You're with Dr. Patterson on the appendectomy in or 2. Try to anticipate what he needs instead of waiting to be told. Sarah nodded and made her way to the scrub station. As she methodically cleaned her hands and arms, she observed Dr. Patterson through the window. He was reviewing the patient's chart, but his movements seemed rushed, distracted. The patient was a young corporal, maybe 22, who'd been complaining of abdominal pain for 2 days before it became severe enough to warrant surgery. She entered the OR as Patterson was making his initial examination. The anesthesiologist, a captain named Williams, was preparing his equipment with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of too many similar procedures. Textbook case, Patterson muttered, palpating the patient's abdomen. Classic presentation. Should be straightforward. Sarah positioned herself at the instrument table, her hands steady as she arranged the surgical tools in precise order. She'd assisted in hundreds of appendectomies, knew the procedure by heart, but something about the patient's presentation nagged at her. The pain pattern wasn't quite right, the timing was off. Scalpel, Patterson said, extending his hand. Sarah placed the instrument in his palm with practiced precision, but her eyes remained on the patient's monitor. Heart rate elevated but stable, blood pressure within normal limits. But there was something in the pattern that didn't match a simple appendicitis. Patterson made his incision, working with competent but hurried movements. Been doing these for 15 years, he said to Williams. Could do them in my sleep. As he worked deeper, Sarah noticed the tissue coloration wasn't what she expected. The inflammation pattern was wrong, too diffuse. She glanced at the patient's chart again, noting the timeline of symptoms, the blood work results that had been rushed through. Doctor, she said quietly, the white cell count seems within normal parameters for appendicitis. Patterson cut her off without looking up. I've got this, nurse. Sarah fell silent, but continued to observe. Patterson was working faster than necessary, his confidence bordering on carelessness. She'd encountered it before, medical units that had closed ranks, that viewed outsiders with suspicion and treated temporary assignments as disruptions rather than assistance. Your shift starts at 0600, Martinez said, finally approaching her directly. We're on a tight ship here, Nurse Chen. Follow protocols, don't question procedures, and remember that in a combat zone, the doctors make the decisions. Clear. Crystal clear, sir. As the day's shift ended and Sarah settled into her temporary quarters, she reflected on her first impressions. The medical staff was competent but insular, protective of their methods, even when those methods were questionable. They'd already decided she was temporary, expendable, not worth their full respect or attention. It was exactly the kind of environment where problems festered unchecked, where egos overrode safety, where the very people meant to save lives might be putting them at risk through arrogance and complacency. Sarah unpacked her few belongings, her movements methodical and unhurried. Tomorrow she would begin her real work, and these people would continue to underestimate her. For now, that was exactly what she needed. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 0545. Sarah was already awake, had been for 20 minutes, lying still in her narrow bunk and listening to the sounds of the base coming to life. She dressed quickly in fresh scrubs, her movements automatic and efficient. The surgical bay was already bustling when she arrived. Dr. Martinez was reviewing the night's casualties with Dr. Kim, their voices low but urgent. 3 soldiers had come in during the early morning hours, 2 with shrapnel wounds, 1 with a traumatic brain injury from an IED blast. Chen. Martinez barely glanced at her. You're with Dr. Patterson on the appendectomy in or 2. Try to anticipate what he needs instead of waiting to be told. Sarah nodded and made her way to the scrub station. As she methodically cleaned her hands and arms, she observed Dr. Patterson through the window. He was reviewing the patient's chart, but his movements seemed rushed, distracted. The patient was a young corporal, maybe 22, who'd been complaining of abdominal pain for 2 days before it became severe enough to warrant surgery. She entered as Patterson was making his initial examination. The anesthesiologist, a captain named Williams, was preparing his equipment with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of too many similar procedures. Textbook case, Patterson muttered, palpating the patient's abdomen. Classic presentation. Should be straightforward. Sarah positioned herself at the instrument table, her hands steady as she arranged the surgical tools in precise order. She'd assisted in hundreds of appendectomies, knew the procedure by heart, but something about the patient's presentation nagged at her. The pain pattern wasn't quite right, the timing was off. Scalpel, Patterson said, extending his hand. Sarah placed the instrument in his palm with practiced precision, but her eyes remained on the patient's monitor. Heart rate elevated but stable, blood pressure within normal limits. But there was something in the pattern that didn't match a simple appendicitis. Patterson made his incision, working with competent but hurried movements. Been doing these for 15 years, he said to Williams. Could do them in my sleep. As he worked deeper, Sarah noticed the tissue coloration wasn't what she expected. The inflammation pattern was wrong, too diffuse. She glanced at the patient's chart again, noting the timeline of symptoms, the blood work results that had been rushed through. Doctor, she said quietly, the white cell count seems within normal parameters for appendicitis. Patterson cut her off without looking up. I've got this, nurse. Sarah fell silent, but continued to observe. Patterson was working faster than necessary, his confidence bordering on carelessness. When he reached the appendix, Sarah could see immediately that it wasn't the source of the problem. The organ was inflamed, yes, but not severely. The real issue was deeper, a small perforation in the bowel wall that was leaking infected material into the abdominal cavity. There we go, Patterson said, beginning to remove the appendix. Textbook case. Doctor, Sarah tried again, her voice calm but insistent. I think you should examine the bowel more thoroughly. There appears to be, Nurse Chen. Patterson's voice carried a sharp edge. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I've been doing surgery since before you graduated nursing school. Please focus on your instruments. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing more. She watched as Patterson completed the appendectomy, missing the small perforation entirely. If left untreated, the patient would develop peritonitis within hours, a potentially fatal complication that would require emergency surgery. As Patterson began closing, Sarah made a decision. She moved closer to the surgical site, ostensibly to better assist with sutures, but actually to get a clearer view of the bowel. The perforation was small but definite, a tiny hole that was seeping infected fluid. Suture, Patterson said, extending his hand. Instead of the suture, Sarah placed a small retractor in his palm. Doctor, if you could just retract here for a moment, I think there's something you should see. Patterson looked up sharply, irritation flashing in his eyes. Nurse, I asked for, please, Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made him pause. Just look. Something in her tone, perhaps, or the absolute certainty in her manner, made Patterson follow her gaze. He looked where she was indicating, and Sarah saw the moment he spotted the perforation. His face went pale. Jesus, he whispered. How did I miss that? It's small, Sarah said diplomatically. Easy to overlook when you're focused on the appendix. Patterson stared at the tiny hole for a long moment, then looked at Sarah with new eyes. If we closed without catching this. The patient would have been back in surgery within 12 hours, Sarah finished quietly, probably with full-blown peritonitis. The rest of the surgery proceeded in silence as Patterson carefully repaired the bowel perforation and thoroughly irrigated the abdominal cavity. Sarah anticipated his every need, her hands moving with a precision that spoke of extensive experience. When he needed a specific suture, it was already in her hand. When he required better visualization, she had the retractor positioned before he asked. "Where did you train?" Patterson asked as he placed the final sutures. "Various places," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "You pick things up." After the surgery, as they cleaned up, Patterson approached her at the scrub sink. "That was good work in there. Really good. You probably saved that kid's life." Sarah continued washing her hands, her expression unchanged. "You would have caught it. Maybe. Maybe not." Patterson studied her profile. "You've done a lot of surgery, haven't you? More than most nurses." "Some," Sarah acknowledged. "Well, I owe you one. And I'll make sure Dr. Martinez knows what happened in there." Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. "That's not necessary. We're all here to take care of the patients." But Patterson was already shaking his head. "No, this is important. Martinez needs to know he's got someone competent on his team." As Sarah left the OR, she felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention. She'd done what was necessary to save a patient's life, but now she'd drawn notice to herself. In her line of work, invisibility was often more valuable than recognition. She made her way to the break room, where Maria Rodriguez was grabbing a quick coffee between cases. "How'd it go with Patterson?" Maria asked. "Fine," Sarah replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Routine appendectomy." Maria studied her for a moment. "You know, there's something different about you. The way you move, the way you handle yourself. You're not like most relief nurses we get." Sarah sipped her coffee, saying nothing. Most of them are either fresh out of school and terrified, or burned out and just going through the motions. But you're something else. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Martinez entered the break room, his expression thoughtful. "Chen, Patterson told me what happened in or two. Said you caught something he missed." Sarah set down her coffee cup. "Dr. Patterson handled the surgery perfectly. I just assisted." Martinez studied her for a long moment. "He said you probably saved the patient's life. That's not just assisting. We're all here for the same reason," Sarah said simply. Martinez nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. She wanted to remain invisible, but competence had a way of drawing attention whether you wanted it or not. And in a place like this, where egos ran high and hierarchies were rigidly maintained, being noticed wasn't always a good thing. As she left the break room, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. She'd prevented a medical disaster, but at the cost of her anonymity. The surgical team would be watching her more closely now, and that could complicate everything. But the patient would live, and in the end, that was what mattered most. The announcement came during the morning briefing, delivered by Colonel Hayes, the base commander, with the kind of force calm that immediately put everyone on edge. "We'll be receiving a visit from General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Surgeon General of the Army, in 72 hours. This is a routine inspection of forward medical facilities, but I want everything running at peak efficiency." Sarah felt her coffee cup grow heavy in her hands. She kept her expression neutral, but internally, every alarm bell was ringing. General Morrison. Of all the generals in the Army Medical Command, it had to be her. Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What's the scope of the inspection, sir?" "Full review of medical protocols, patient outcomes, supply management, and staff performance. The general will observe surgeries, review case files, and conduct interviews with medical personnel." Colonel Hayes's eyes swept the room. "I trust one don't need to emphasize how important it is that we make a good impression." As the briefing dispersed, Sarah noticed the immediate change in atmosphere. The surgical staff, who had been operating with casual confidence just moments before, now moved with the nervous energy of people who knew they were about to be scrutinized. "Shit," Dr. Kim muttered to Martinez as they walked past Sarah. "Morrison's got a reputation. She's the one who shut down that field hospital in Iraq for protocol violations." "We'll be fine," Martinez replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "We just need to tighten things up a bit." Sarah followed at a distance, listening to their conversation with growing unease. She knew exactly what General Morrison's reputation was. The woman was brilliant, uncompromising, and had zero tolerance for medical malpractice. She was also Sarah's direct superior, though no one here knew that. Over the next 2 days, the hospital transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Supply closets were reorganized, equipment was calibrated, and suddenly everyone was following protocols they'd been ignoring for months. Sarah watched it all with a mixture of professional interest and personal dread. "Chun, I need you to help me review these case files," Dr. Patterson called out on the second day. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes from staying up late, trying to bring documentation up to standard. Sarah approached his desk, where patient charts were spread out in chaotic piles. "What do you need me to do?" "Just look through these and make sure everything's documented properly. Times, medications, procedures." As Sarah began reviewing the files, her worst fears were confirmed. The documentation was sloppy at best, dangerous at worst. Medication dosages that didn't match what was actually administered. Surgical notes that were incomplete or inaccurate. Timestamps that had clearly been falsified to make response times look better. "Dr. Patterson," she said carefully, "some of these entries don't match the actual procedures performed." Patterson looked up from his own pile of charts, stress evident in every line of his face. "What do you mean?" Sarah pointed to a specific entry. "This says the patient received 2 units of blood, but the blood bank records show 4 units were dispensed for this case." Patterson grabbed the chart, scanning it quickly. "Probably just a transcription error. Fix it. But if the documentation doesn't match the actual treatment, just fix it, Chun. We don't have time for perfectionism right now." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. She was being asked to falsify medical records, to cover up discrepancies that could indicate serious problems with patient care. Every instinct she had as both a medical professional and an investigator rebelled against it. "I can't do that," she said quietly. Patterson's head snapped up. "Excuse me. I can't alter medical records. It's not just unethical, it's illegal." The room went quiet. Dr. Martinez, who had been working at a nearby desk, looked up with sharp attention. Other staff members stopped what they were doing, sensing the tension. "Nurse Chen," Martinez said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "Dr. Patterson is asking you to correct documentation errors. That's part of your job." Sarah met his gaze steadily. Correcting genuine errors is one thing. Altering records to hide discrepancies is another. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares, the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. She crossed a line, challenged their authority in front of the entire staff. "Maybe," Dr. Kim said slowly, "our relief nurse doesn't understand how things work in a combat zone. Sometimes you have to be flexible with paperwork when you're trying to save lives." "Understand perfectly," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "I also understand that falsifying medical records puts patients at risk and violates every ethical standard we're supposed to uphold." Martinez stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You know what, Chun? You've been here less than a week, and you're already causing problems. Maybe you should focus on doing your job, instead of lecturing doctors who've been saving lives while you were probably working in some cushy civilian hospital." Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the assumption that her quiet demeanor meant she lacked experience or backbone. She'd heard variations of this speech countless times over the years, from people who had no idea who they were talking to. "I'm just trying to ensure we maintain proper standards," she said evenly. "Standards?" Martinez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me tell you about standards, nurse. The standard here is keeping soldiers alive. The standard is working 18-hour days with inadequate supplies and constant pressure. The standard is doing whatever it takes to get the job done, even if it means compromising patient safety." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Martinez's face went dark, and Sarah realized she'd pushed too far. In trying to maintain her cover while upholding her principles, she'd created an impossible situation. "You know what?" Martinez said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Maybe you're not the right fit for this assignment. Maybe we should request a different relief nurse. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If she was removed from the assignment, her investigation would be over before it really began. But if she backed down now, she'd be complicit in the very problem she'd been sent to investigate. "That's your decision to make," she said finally. Martinez stared at her for a long moment, clearly expecting her to back down, to apologize and fall in line. When she didn't, his expression hardened. "Get back to work," he said curtly, "and remember your place." As the staff dispersed, Sarah returned to her duties with a heavy heart. She maintained her principles, but at a significant cost. The surgical team now viewed her as a troublemaker, an outsider who didn't understand their world. The irony wasn't lost on her. She understood their world better than any of them could imagine. That evening, as she sat alone in her quarters, Sarah reflected on the impossible position she found herself in. In less than 24 hours, General Morrison would arrive, and Sarah would have to maintain her cover while watching her superior conduct an investigation that Sarah herself had initiated. The general would expect a full report on what Sarah had observed, but providing that report would mean revealing her true identity and ending her undercover assignment. Yet the problems she'd already identified were serious enough to warrant immediate action. Sarah stared at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the distant sounds of the base settling into its nighttime routine. Tomorrow would bring challenges she wasn't sure she was prepared for, decisions that would affect not just her mission, but the lives of everyone in this facility. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. The helicopters came in low and fast at 0347, their rotors cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like mechanical thunder. Sarah was already awake, had been for the past hour, unable to sleep as anxiety about the general's impending arrival gnawed at her. The sound of incoming casualties was almost a relief. At least it was something she could handle. The first bird touched down as she reached the trauma bay, and she could tell immediately this was going to be bad. The crew chief was shouting over the rotor wash, his voice tight with urgency. "Multiple casualties. IED strike on a convoy. We've got critical." The first stretcher came through the doors carrying a young sergeant, maybe 19, with massive trauma to his left leg. Behind him came a specialist with shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms, conscious but in shock. The third casualty made Sarah's breath catch. A lieutenant with a penetrating head wound, blood seeping through the field dressing, his pupils unequal and sluggish. Dr. Martinez appeared at her shoulder, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his movements sharp with adrenaline. "Jesus Christ. King Patterson, we need all hands." The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos. Sarah moved automatically to the head trauma case, her hands already reaching for supplies as the medics transferred the lieutenant to the examination table. His vitals were deteriorating rapidly, blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing, signs of increased intracranial pressure. "This one needs surgery now," she called out, but Martinez was already focused on the leg trauma, barking orders at Dr. Kim while Dr. Patterson worked on the shrapnel wounds. "Chun, start a line and get him typed and crossed for 6 units," Martinez called without looking up from his own patient. Sarah was already moving, her hands steady as she established 4 access and drew blood samples. But as she worked, she could see the bigger picture that the others were missing. They were treating each patient in isolation, not coordinating care, not prioritizing based on survivability. The lieutenant's condition was deteriorating faster than anyone realized except her. His Glasgow coma scale was dropping, and she could see the subtle signs of brain herniation beginning. He needed immediate surgical intervention, not just stabilization. "Doctor," she called to Martinez, "this patient needs to go to, or immediately. He's showing signs of." "I can see that," Martinez snapped, not looking up from the leg amputation he was trying to save. "Get him stable, and we'll get to him." But Sarah knew there wasn't time. In her experience she couldn't reveal, she'd seen dozens of similar cases. The lieutenant had maybe 20 minutes before the brain swelling became irreversible. The leg amputation, while traumatic, wasn't immediately life-threatening if properly managed. She looked around the trauma bay and realized with growing horror that the surgical team was making the wrong calls. Dr. Kim was spending precious time on cosmetic repair of facial lacerations while ignoring internal bleeding. Dr. Patterson was over-treating the shrapnel wounds, focusing on minor fragments while missing a piece near the heart. Dr. Martinez, she tried again, her voice carrying more authority than she'd allowed herself before. The head trauma needs immediate craniotomy. The leg can wait. Martinez finally looked up, his face flushed with stress and anger. Nurse Chen, I don't have time for your opinions right now. Do your job and let me do mine. Sarah felt something snap inside her. She'd watched good soldiers die because of medical incompetence before, and she wouldn't watch it happen again. Not when she had the knowledge and authority to prevent it. The patient is herniating, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. He needs surgical decompression in the next 15 minutes, or he's going to die. Something in her tone made everyone in the trauma bay pause. Dr. Kim looked up from his suturing, Dr. Patterson stopped what he was doing, and even Martinez turned to stare at her. What did you say? Martinez asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her military bearing was showing the authority she'd spent years learning to project. But the lieutenant was dying, and she couldn't stand by and watch. I said he's herniating. Look at his pupils. Left is blown, right is sluggish. His blood pressure is dropping, and his heart rate is climbing. Classic signs of increased intracranial pressure. He needs immediate surgical intervention. Martinez stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. Her assessment was too precise, too confident, too professional for a relief nurse. How do you know that? He asked slowly. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Because I've seen it before. Where? Where have you seen it before? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention, could sense that her cover was about to be blown. But the lieutenant's monitor was alarming, his condition deteriorating by the second. Does it matter? She asked. He's dying. Martinez looked from her to the patient and back again. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, his ego warring with his medical training, his authority challenged by someone he dismissed as incompetent. Fine, he said finally. Kim, take the head trauma, 2 or 1. Chen, you're with him. As they rushed the lieutenant to surgery, Sarah felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders. In the OR, she moved with the precision and authority of someone who'd done this countless times before. She anticipated Dr. Kim's every need, her hands moving with surgical precision as she assisted with the craniotomy. Pressure's coming down, Kim murmured as he removed the bone flap and relieved the pressure on the brain. Good call, Chun. Another 10 minutes, and we would have lost him. Sarah said nothing, but she could feel Kim's eyes on her as they worked. Her movements were too sure, too practiced. She was handling instruments with the confidence of someone who'd done more than just assist in surgeries. When they finally closed, the lieutenant's vitals had stabilized. He would live, though his recovery would be long and uncertain. As they cleaned up, Kim approached her at the scrub sink. That was impressive work in there, he said quietly. You handled those instruments like you've done neurosurgery before. Sarah continued, washing her hands, her expression neutral. You pick things up. No, Kim said, shaking his head. That wasn't picking things up. That was experience. Real experience. He paused, studying her profile. Who are you, really? Before Sarah could answer, Dr. Martinez burst through the doors, his face dark with anger and suspicion. We need to talk, he said to Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of authority and accusation. Now, as Sarah followed him out of the OR, she knew her time was running out. The general would arrive in less than 12 hours, and her cover was hanging by a thread. She'd saved a life, but at the cost of her mission. The question now was whether she could maintain her deception long enough to complete her investigation, or if everything would unravel before she could gather the evidence she needed to doctor. Martinez led Sarah to his office, a cramped space barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. He closed the door with deliberate force and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and suspicion that had been building since the trauma bay. "Sit down," he said, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a request. Sarah remained standing, her posture straight but not defiant. "Is there a problem, doctor?" Martinez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A problem? You tell me. Nurse Chen, you just diagnosed a brain herniation faster than I did, directed a neurosurgical procedure like you've done 100 times before, and handled surgical instruments with the precision of someone who's had years of advanced training." He moved around his desk, never taking his eyes off her. "So, I'll ask you again, who are you really?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm a registered nurse with experience in trauma care. My credentials are on file." "Your credentials," Martinez said, pulling out a folder from his desk, "show nursing school graduation, basic trauma certification, and a series of short-term assignments at various hospitals. Nothing that would explain what I just witnessed." He opened the folder and spread the papers across his desk. Sarah Chen graduated from University of California Nursing Program, worked at 3 different hospitals in the past 2 years, all temporary assignments. Clean record, good evaluations, but nothing exceptional. Nothing that screams neurosurgical expertise. Sarah glanced at the papers, her carefully constructed cover identity, complete with fabricated employment history and references. It was solid work, but it was designed to make her appear unremarkable, not to withstand the kind of scrutiny she was now facing. "Sometimes experience comes from unexpected places," she said carefully. "Bullshit." Martinez slammed his hand on the desk, making the papers jump. "I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, Chun. I know the difference between someone who's picked things up and someone who's had formal training. What you did in there wasn't luck or intuition, it was expertise." Sarah remained silent, calculating her options. She could maintain her cover and hope Martinez would drop his suspicions, but that seemed increasingly unlikely. She could reveal part of the truth, admit to more medical training than her cover suggested, but that would only raise more questions. Or she could trust him with the full truth, but that would end her mission before it was complete. "You know what I think?" Martinez continued, beginning to pace in the small space. "I think you're not who you say you are. I think you're here for a reason that has nothing to do with providing nursing support." He stopped pacing and fixed her with a hard stare. "The timing is awfully convenient, don't you think? You show up a week before a general's inspection, start questioning our procedures, challenging our authority, and now you're demonstrating skills that don't match your supposed background." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Martinez was connecting dots she'd hoped would remain separate. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it outright." Martinez's voice rose, and Sarah was grateful the office walls were thick. "You're some kind of investigator, aren't you? Military police, inspector general, maybe even civilian oversight. You're here to spy on us." The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah could see the fear behind Martinez's anger. The terror of a man who knew his unit's practices wouldn't stand up to scrutiny, who was facing the possibility of career destruction. "Dr. Martinez," she said quietly, "I understand you're under a lot of stress with the inspection coming up, but don't." His voice was sharp as a scalpel. "Don't patronize me. I know what I saw in that trauma bay. I know what I've been seeing all week. You move like military, you think like military, and you sure as hell don't act like any relief nurse I've ever worked with." He leaned forward, his hands braced on the desk. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly who you are and why you're really here, or I'm going to make sure you're on the next transport out of here." Sarah considered her options. Martinez was clearly intelligent enough to have pieced together significant portions of the truth. Denying everything would only make him more suspicious, and if he followed through on his threat to have her removed, her investigation would be over. "And if I refuse to answer your questions," she asked, "then I'll make sure everyone on this base knows you're not who you claim to be. I'll have your credentials reviewed, your background investigated, and your access to patients revoked." Martinez's eyes were hard as flint. "I won't have a spy in my unit, especially not when we're about to be inspected." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Martinez held all the cards. He could destroy her cover with a single phone call, end her mission before she'd gathered enough evidence to make a difference. But she also knew that backing down now would only confirm his suspicions. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "Am I? Then prove it. Tell me who you really are." Before Sarah could respond, there was a sharp knock on the office door. Dr. Kim's voice came through the wood, tight with urgency. "Martinez, we need you in the trauma bay. Now." Martinez cursed under his breath, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "This conversation isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." As they left the office, Sarah could feel the weight of his suspicion following her like a shadow. The surgical team was already looking at her differently. She could see it in their glances, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the subtle shift in how they interacted with her. The trauma bay was buzzing with activity as they prepared for another incoming casualty, a single soldier with severe burns from a vehicle fire. As Sarah moved to assist, she noticed the way the other nurses stepped back, giving her space but also distance. Word was spreading, she realized. Martinez's suspicions were becoming common knowledge. Dr. Patterson approached her as she prepared burn dressings. "Chen, maybe you should sit this one out. Let the regular staff handle it." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the discomfort in his eyes. "I'm qualified to assist with burn treatment." "I'm sure you are," Patterson said carefully. "But given the questions about your background, maybe it's better if you observe for now." The dismissal stung, but Sarah understood the position they were putting her in. By questioning her credentials, Martinez had effectively neutralized her ability to function as part of the team. She was being isolated, marginalized, turned into an outsider in a place where teamwork was essential for saving lives. As she stepped back and watched the team work on the burn victim, Sarah realized how precarious her situation had become. In less than 8 hours, General Morrison would arrive for her inspection. Sarah's mission was to provide intelligence on the unit's practices and problems, but now she was the problem, a suspected spy whose presence was disrupting the very team she was supposed to be investigating. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to maintain her cover while upholding her professional standards, she created a situation where she could accomplish neither. Martinez's suspicions were justified, but his response was making it impossible for her to complete her mission. As the burn victim was stabilized and transferred to the ICU, Sarah found herself alone in the trauma bay, cleaning equipment that didn't need cleaning, organizing supplies that were already organized. She was being frozen out, and everyone knew it. The question now was whether she could survive the next few hours without her cover being completely blown, and whether she'd gathered enough evidence to justify the risks she'd taken. Time was running out, and Sarah could feel the weight of impending discovery pressing down on her like a physical force. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight brought only uncertainty and the growing realization that her carefully planned mission was spiraling out of control. General Patricia Morrison arrived at 0800 sharp, stepping off the transport helicopter with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Sarah watched from the window of the supply room, where she'd been relegated to inventory duty, Martinez's not-so-subtle way of keeping her away from the inspection team. The general was exactly as Sarah remembered her, tall, silver-haired, with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. She wore her dress uniform with the kind of precision that spoke to decades of military service, her ribbons and decorations telling the story of a career spent in the most challenging assignments the Army Medical Corps had to offer. Colonel Hayes met her at the landing pad, along with Martinez and the other senior medical staff. Sarah could see them through the window, their postures rigid with nervous attention as the general began her initial briefing. "Chen," Dr. Kim appeared in the doorway of the supply room. "Martinez wants you in, or 3. We're doing a demonstration surgery for the general's team." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Of all the ways this could go wrong, being in the same room as General Morrison during a surgical procedure was perhaps the worst. But refusing would only confirm Martinez's suspicions about her. "What kind of procedure?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Gallbladder removal. Routine laparoscopic surgery. The general wants to observe our standard protocols." Kim paused, studying her face. "Martinez specifically requested you assist. Said he wanted to show off our experienced relief nurse." The emphasis on experience made it clear that Martinez was setting a trap. He suspected her true identity and was putting her in a position where she'd either have to reveal her expertise or fail spectacularly in front of the general. Sarah followed Kim 2 or 3, where the surgical team was already preparing. The patient was a staff sergeant with chronic gallbladder inflammation, a routine case that should have been straightforward. But as Sarah entered the room, she could feel the tension crackling like electricity. General Morrison stood in the observation area above the oar, her aide taking notes as she watched the preparations below. Her eyes swept the room with professional interest, cataloging every detail of the setup, the equipment, the staff interactions. Nurse Chen will be assisting today, Martinez announced loudly enough for the general to hear. She's been with us for a week now, and we thought it would be good to demonstrate how we integrate temporary staff into our procedures. Sarah moved to the instrument table, her hands steady despite the churning in her stomach. She could feel the general's eyes on her, though Morrison showed no sign of recognition. Yet, the surgery began routinely enough. "Nurse Chen, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The general studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Sarah could see the recognition dawning in Morrison's eyes, the pieces clicking into place. "Nurse Chen," the general repeated slowly. "How long have you been assigned to this unit?" "1 week, ma'am." "And your previous assignment?" Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention, the surgical team watching this exchange with growing curiosity. "Various hospitals, ma'am. Temporary assignments." General Morrison nodded thoughtfully, then did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute. The oar erupted in shocked silence. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his face pale with confusion. "General, I don't understand." "Colonel Chen," General Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "I believe we need to discuss your findings." The words hit the surgical team like a physical blow. Dr. Patterson's face went white. Dr. Kim stepped backward as if he'd been struck. Martinez stared at Sarah with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "Colonel," Martinez whispered. Sarah straightened to her full height, her military bearing now unmistakable. "Yes, doctor." "Colonel Sarah Chen, Army Medical Corps, Inspector General's office." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, everything changed: the power dynamics, the relationships, the very nature of Sarah's presence in their unit. She was no longer the quiet relief nurse they could dismiss and marginalize. She was their superior officer, and she had been watching everything. The conference room felt smaller with General Morrison's presence filling it. Sarah sat at the long table, her posture military straight, while the surgical staff occupied chairs that suddenly felt like defendants' benches. Colonel Hayes sat at the head of the table, his face ashen as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," General Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Colonel Chen has been conducting an undercover investigation of this medical unit for the past week, during which time she observed and documented numerous protocol violations, safety concerns, and professional misconduct." She opened a thick folder and spread photographs across the table. Images Sarah had taken with a concealed camera over the past week. Improperly sterilized instruments, medication discrepancies, falsified documentation. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Dr. Martinez stared at the photographs as if they were venomous snakes. This is entrapment. She deliberately deceived us." "Dr. Martinez," General Morrison's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Colonel Chen was conducting a legitimate investigation based on serious allegations of medical malpractice that resulted in preventable soldier deaths. The deception was necessary because previous inspections had failed to uncover the systemic problems in this unit." Sarah watched the faces around the table as the general continued her briefing. Dr. Patterson looked sick, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the implications. Dr. Kim sat in stunned silence, his career flashing before his eyes. Martinez's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a kind of desperate calculation. "The allegations," General Morrison continued, include improper medication administration resulting in 2 deaths, surgical complications due to inadequate sterilization protocols, falsification of medical records to cover up mistakes, and a pattern of intimidation towards staff members who attempted to report safety concerns. Colonel Hayes cleared his throat. General, what exactly are we looking at in terms of consequences? Morrison's expression was granite hard. That depends on Colonel Chen's findings and recommendations. Colonel. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Nurse Chen, ma'am, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The general studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Sarah could see the recognition dawning in Morrison's eyes, the pieces clicking into place. Nurse Chen, the general repeated slowly. How long have you been assigned to this unit? 1 week, ma'am. And your previous assignment? Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention, the surgical team watching this exchange with growing curiosity. Various hospitals, ma'am. Temporary assignments. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully, then did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute. The roar erupted in shocked silence. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his face pale with confusion. General, I don't understand. Colonel Chen, General Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. I believe we need to discuss your findings. The words hit the surgical team like a physical blow. Dr. Patterson's face went white. Dr. Kim stepped backward as if he'd been struck. Martinez stared at Sarah with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Colonel, Martinez whispered. Sarah straightened to her full height, her military bearing now unmistakable. Yes, doctor. Colonel Sarah Chen, Army Medical Corps, Inspector General's office. The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, everything changed: the power dynamics, the relationships, the very nature of Sarah's presence in their unit. She was no longer the quiet relief nurse they could dismiss and marginalize. She was their superior officer, and she had been watching everything. The conference room felt smaller with General Morrison's presence filling it. Sarah sat at the long table, her posture military straight, while the surgical staff occupied chairs that suddenly felt like defendants' benches. Colonel Hayes sat at the head of the table, his face ashen as the full scope of the situation became clear. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, General Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Colonel Chen has been conducting an undercover investigation of this medical unit for the past week, during which time she observed and documented numerous protocol violations, safety concerns, and professional misconduct. She opened a thick folder and spread photographs across the table, images Sarah had taken with a concealed camera over the past week. Improperly sterilized instruments, medication discrepancies, falsified documentation. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Dr. Martinez stared at the photographs as if they were venomous snakes. This is entrapment. She deliberately deceived us. Dr. Martinez, General Morrison's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Colonel Chen was conducting a legitimate investigation based on serious allegations of medical malpractice that resulted in preventable soldier deaths. The deception was necessary because previous inspections had failed to uncover the systemic problems in this unit. Sarah watched the faces around the table as the general continued her briefing. Dr. Patterson looked sick, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the implications. Dr. Kim sat in stunned silence, his career flashing before his eyes. Martinez's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a kind of desperate calculation. The allegations, General Morrison continued, include improper medication administration resulting in 2 deaths, surgical complications due to inadequate sterilization protocols, falsification of medical records to cover up mistakes, and a pattern of intimidation towards staff members who attempted to report safety concerns. Colonel Hayes cleared his throat. General, what exactly are we looking at in terms of consequences? Morrison's expression was granite hard. That depends on Colonel Chen's findings and recommendations. Colonel. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. These people had treated her with contempt and dismissal, had tried to pressure her into falsifying records, had created a culture where patient safety took a back seat to ego and convenience. But they were also human beings with families, careers, and lives that would be destroyed by what she was about to say. Over the past week, Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. I documented 17 separate protocol violations, 12 instances of improper medication administration, and evidence of systematic falsification of medical records. I also observed a culture of intimidation that prevented junior staff from reporting safety concerns. She paused, looking at each face around the table. However, I also observed dedicated medical professionals working under extreme stress with inadequate resources. The problems I identified are systemic, not necessarily indicative of malicious intent. Dr. Martinez looked up sharply, hope flickering in his eyes. Colonel, we've been doing our best under impossible circumstances. The supply shortages, the constant pressure. The Dr. Martinez, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. The circumstances don't excuse endangering patients, but they do provide context for how these problems developed. General Morrison leaned forward. What are your recommendations, Colonel? Sarah had been dreading this moment since her cover was blown. Her recommendations would determine the fate of everyone in this room, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. I recommend immediate suspension of Dr. Martinez, pending a full review of his cases and administrative practices. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Kim should undergo mandatory retraining in surgical protocols and be placed under direct supervision for a period of 6 months. The words fell like hammer blows. Martinez's face crumpled, the reality of career destruction hitting him fully. Patterson closed his eyes, his hands clenched into fists on the table. However, Sarah continued, I also recommend that these actions be taken in the context of systemic reform rather than punitive measures alone. This unit needs additional resources, better training protocols, and a complete overhaul of its safety culture. She turned to face Martinez directly. Dr. Martinez, your surgical skills are excellent. Your diagnostic abilities are sound. But your leadership created an environment where safety concerns were dismissed and junior staff were intimidated into silence. That cannot continue. Martinez met her gaze, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, but a kind of broken understanding. You're right, he said quietly. I know you're right. We were so overwhelmed, and I thought if we could just keep the numbers up, keep the mortality rates down. At what cost? Sarah asked gently. How many near misses were covered up? How many complications were attributed to combat conditions when they were really the result of preventable errors? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah could see the recognition in their faces, the acknowledgement that they had lost their way, that the pressure to perform had corrupted their fundamental mission to do no harm. Dr. Kim spoke for the first time since the revelation. What about the junior staff? The nurses, the technicians? They try to speak up, and we shut them down. They'll be protected, General Morrison said firmly. Anyone who attempted to report safety concerns will be commended, not punished. We need to encourage that kind of professional courage, not suppress it. Sarah thought about Maria Rodriguez, about the other nurses who had tried to maintain standards despite the hostile environment. They deserved better than what they'd received. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. The investigation was initiated because of a specific incident, a soldier who died from complications that should have been preventable. His family deserves to know the truth. The room fell silent again. Sarah could see the impact of her words on the surgical team, the realization that their actions had real consequences beyond their own careers. Private Johnson, Dr. Patterson said quietly. The appendectomy that went wrong. Sarah nodded. The post-operative infection was caused by improper sterilization protocols. The delayed recognition of complications was due to inadequate monitoring. The death was preventable. Martinez buried his face in his hands. His mother called me. She wanted to know if he suffered, if there was anything more we could have done. What did you tell her? Sarah asked. I told her we did everything possible, that it was just one of those things that happens in combat medicine. Martinez looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. I lied to her. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt the weight of it, the human cost of the systemic failures she'd been sent to investigate. She deserves the truth, Sarah said finally. They all do. General Morrison closed the folder of evidence. The formal investigation will continue, but Colonel Chen's preliminary findings are sufficient to begin immediate corrective action. Dr. Martinez, you're relieved of command effective immediately. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Kim, you'll remain on duty under supervision while we implement new protocols. As the meeting broke up, Sarah found herself alone with Martinez in the conference room. He sat slumped in his chair, the weight of his career's end visible in every line of his body. I want you to know, he said without looking up, that what you did in that trauma bay, saving that lieutenant, that was good medicine. Real medicine. The kind we should have been practicing all along. Sarah sat down across from him. It's not too late to change. This doesn't have to be the end of your career if you're willing to learn from it. Martinez looked up at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. After everything I put you through, the way I treated you, you were protecting something you thought was important, Sarah said. You were wrong about the methods, but the instinct to protect your team, to maintain standards, that's not entirely misguided. It just needs to be channeled properly. For the first time since the revelation, Martinez smiled. A small, sad expression, but genuine. You know, if you'd told me a week ago that I'd be taking career advice from a relief nurse, I'd have laughed. But you're not really a relief nurse, are you? No, Sarah admitted. But I'm a doctor, and I believe in second chances when they're earned. As she left the conference room, Sarah reflected on the complexity of what had just transpired. Justice had been served, but it came with a human cost that weighed heavily on her conscience. The investigation was complete, but the real work, rebuilding a broken system and restoring trust, was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd first arrived, watching the morning helicopter prepare for departure. Her single duffel bag sat at her feet, packed with the same efficiency that had marked her arrival. The Afghan sun beat down with familiar intensity, but the base felt different now, quieter, more purposeful, somehow cleaner. The changes had been swift and comprehensive. A new chief of surgery had arrived within days of Martinez's suspension. Colonel Rebecca Torres, a no-nonsense trauma surgeon with a reputation for both excellence and integrity. New protocols had been implemented, supply chains reorganized, and most importantly, a culture of open communication had begun to take root. Maria Rodriguez approached from the hospital building, her steps hesitant. Over the past weeks, she'd struggled with the revelation of Sarah's true identity, feeling betrayed by the deception, even as she understood its necessity. So you're really leaving, Maria said, stopping a few feet away. My work here is done, Sarah replied simply. Is it? Maria's voice carried a note of challenge. Martinez is gone. Patterson and Kim are walking on eggshells, and half the staff still doesn't know what to think about what happened. You could stay, help us rebuild properly. Sarah turned to face her, seeing the genuine concern in the younger woman's eyes. Colonel Torres is more than capable of handling the rebuilding. She doesn't need me looking over her shoulder. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Maria stepped closer, lowering her voice. People are confused, Sarah. They don't know whether to see you as a hero who exposed dangerous practices or as a spy who betrayed their trust. The observation hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She'd spent the past 3 weeks watching the staff struggle with the aftermath of her investigation, seeing the way some looked at her with gratitude, while others couldn't hide their resentment. What do you see me as? Sarah asked. Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering. I see someone who did what was necessary, even when it was hard, even when it cost you something. Through the hospital windows, Sarah could see the morning shift beginning their rounds. The new protocols were being followed meticulously, the documentation was accurate, and the culture of intimidation that had pervaded the unit was slowly being replaced by one of professional accountability. Dr. Kim emerged from the building, his movements more confident than they'd been in weeks. The mandatory retraining had been difficult for him, a blow to his professional pride, but he'd embraced it with the dedication of someone who genuinely wanted to improve. "Colonel Chen," he called out as he approached. "I wanted to catch you before you left." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. Their relationship had been complicated since the revelation. He respected her expertise and was grateful for the changes she'd brought about, but the deception still stung. "I wanted to thank you," Kim said, his words carefully chosen, "for what you did in that trauma bay with the lieutenant. And for giving us a chance to do better. You always had the skills, Doctor. You just needed the right environment to use them properly." Kim similed ruefully. "It's funny. I spent years thinking I was a good surgeon, and it turns out I was just getting by. The retraining has been humbling, but I'm a better doctor now than I was a month ago." Sarah felt a familiar warmth at his words. This was why she did the work she did. Not for the investigations or the disciplinary actions, but for moments like this when good people found their way back to being their best selves. Dr. Patterson appeared in the doorway of the hospital, watching from a distance. He'd struggled the most with the aftermath, his confidence shattered by the realization of how many mistakes he'd been making. But Colonel Torres had worked with him patiently, rebuilding his skills and his self-assurance one procedure at a time. "What about Martinez?" Maria asked, following Sarah's gaze. "Have you heard anything?" Sarah nodded. "He's been assigned to a teaching position at Walter Reed. No patient care responsibilities, but he'll be training the next generation of military surgeons." General Morrison felt his experience, properly channeled, could be valuable. It had been Sarah's recommendation, actually. Despite everything that had happened, she'd seen something in Martinez worth salvaging. A genuine dedication to medicine that had been corrupted by circumstances and poor leadership, but not destroyed. The helicopter pilot signaled that it was time to board. Sarah picked up her duffel bag, the weight of it familiar and comforting. She'd carried similar bags to dozens of assignments over the years, each one a chapter in a career spent in the shadows, doing work that rarely received recognition or thanks. "Will we see you again?" Maria asked. "Probably not," Sarah replied honestly. "But you don't need me anymore.